I'm Lisa Mabli, and this is What Would Lisa Say? And right now we're going to talk about what I would say if you asked me whether you need to put story points on bugs you find on sprint work within the sprint. And the answer is no. Please don't do that. That takes a whole lot of time that you guys probably don't have on your team. So, how do you deal with something that QA finds in the work that devs are doing during the sprint? How do you account for that? Well, you accounted for it when you gave the story point estimate on the original story, because if you remember, part of a story point estimate has to do with risk, which is the risk of rework. You're not always going to get that right. You may not realize that you have to do rework on something. But as experience comes to your team, and as you run into more and more of these, you will recognize the stories on which you probably need a slightly higher story point value, because the risk of having to do some rework, in other words, the risk that QA will find something wrong with the code that the devs have written, tends to be higher in that area of code or that kind of work, or however you want to look at it. So you do not actually put additional story points on something simply because you find that it has to be sent back to dev for rework. You simply make a mental note, or even better, put it on a process improvement board so you remember this particular instance and talk about it in retro about how this kind of work always seems to come back from QA with additional rework that's required. And then when this kind of work comes up in the future, simply keep that in mind in your story point estimate and roll that up into the risk aspect of it. When QA finds an issue with the work that's being done in the sprint, you don't even have to create an entirely new issue for it. If you use subtasks or some other kind of children of a parent story, feel free to use one of those just to annotate the steps to reproduce and whatever it is that QA found. And then that just gets carried along with the parent story back to dev and back through QA, hopefully only one more time, and then on to its deployment to whatever environment it's going to be deployed in. So short answer, no, don't put additional story points on something just because you found some problem with it, whether you call it a defect or a bug, and this is in sprint work. Simply make a note of it, talk about it, and then the next time that kind of work comes up, be sure to include that in your story point estimate for the original story, and then you will find that your sprints become a lot more predictable.